After a bit of delay, welcome to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Study, both you online and you here in the audience. Apparently there was a power cut in most of Stockholm. I'm very happy to have Bo Malmberg here. He got his PhD in human geography from Uppsala University and is now a professor of geography at Stockholm University. And he has been visiting research at Berkeley and Harvard, and also, and not least important, he was a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies between 2002 and 2011. I'm correctly informed.
Yes.
That was a bit before I came here, but quite a long time. And his research interests includes economic geography, population geography, urban geography, with a focus on residential segregation and neighborhood effects, which is what I think you're going to talk about partly today.
Yes,
you run a big RJ program on the neighborhood revisited, and I look forward to hear more about that today. The title is Spatial Polarization in Sweden, Patterns, Driving Forces and Consequences. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's good to have an opportunity to be back at the Institute for Future Studies. Last time I had in those early years I was looking at on population processes, but then in the last 10 years I kind of shifted focus to so the title is Spatial Polarization in Sweden, Patterns, Driving Forces and Consequences. And the issue here that we will talk about today is segregation and the kind of understanding segregation. I came into this research a little more than 10 years ago, but then since then it has of course emerged as a very important topic in the Swedish debate. We could hear it yesterday in the speech by the new Prime Minister that segregation is one of the main issues that will be in focus in the coming years. But interest in segregation then goes back quite a long time. If you go in Sweden, it goes back to the 1970s, when kind of segregation first started to be discussed. But when you talk about segregation, there is to some extent a need to differentiate between segregation as a live world concept, as a concept of as part of the urban experience, and segregation as a research subject. Those are not always the same. But if you first think then of segregation as a live world concept, that is, segregation is part of how we experience the city. But if you can think of taking a walk through the city, and then you will, or a long walk, then you will go through different neighborhoods, and then you will notice that they have varying ethnic and social composition, and it's very much one part of it is that you have parts of the city where minorities and marginal groups are concentrated, but you can find other parts of the city then when you find the affluent and strong representation of the majority population. When it comes to segregation in research, there are kind of three issues that are important. One is measurement, and here's this conflict between live world experience of segregation and what the researchers find is interesting, that to some extent what the way we measure segregation doesn't always correspond to how segregation is perceived. But the issue here is that patterns and change over time in segregation. Another issue then is explanation, kind of what are the driving forces, what processes are behind segregation. And a third issue then is to look at consequences. How does this segregation affect individuals and societies? And here the important issue has been called neighborhood effects. To what extent are individuals, especially young people, influenced by the place where they grow up? And another big area then is crime. Kind of, to what extent is crime affected by segregation? My own research then has been mainly with respect to measurements and consequences, and not that much on explanation. But that is in fact what I will concentrate on today, then, to go into kind of understanding segregation. What are the driving forces? So if we look then briefly on theories of residential segregation, one simple explanation is that there can be enforced segregation, and historically this has not been important, that groups have been assigned to different parts of the city by administrative decisions. We know that, for example, for use in the European cities, that they were assigned to specific parts of the city, but we also have seen it in other countries, in South Africa and in the US, that you had decisions on where certain groups were allowed to live. Another process can be discrimination, which I hear proposed that is privately enforced segregation, that has been seen a lot in the US, that historically that blacks were not allowed by the housing authorities to come into certain areas, and then we still have it today. We know that there are you can see landlords that in fact prefer certain ethnicities in relation to others. But then in the research, kind of preferences have had a big focus, ethnic preferences, and then the kind of catchphrase here, or the summary is this the saying that birds of a feather flock together. That people, we want to live with people, want to have people around us that are similar to us, to ourselves, in terms of ethnicity or in terms of social status. And the most famous model in this is the Schelling model, which I will come back to later. That has an idea of how kind of ethnic preferences can shape segregation patterns. And when it comes to empirical evidence of this, David Card, who will get the Nobel Prize here in economics next week, has one of his papers is on this empirical evidence for the Schelling model, and specifically that there can be kind of a threshold effect of segregation, that when the proportion of a certain ethnic group goes over a certain level, there will be a flight out from that neighborhood, a tipping point effect. And that model I will criticize, based both theoretically and with some empirical examples. And then I will go on then to a kind of fourth idea of how segregation can be explained, where kind of stigmatization or neighborhood reputation is the important factor, and also that symbolic representation can play a role, but I will come back to that. So we start then with the Schelling model, and what I will say here is based on a paper that I've written together with Bill Clark at UCLA. He's a long-term researcher in this field, geographer. And what we do in this paper, then we start out with the Schelling model, where essentially what the Schelling model says is that ethnic preferences will lead to complete segregation, even if most people want to live in kind of mixed neighborhoods. If there are some people that have kind of low, are very sensitive to minority groups, then a small increase in a minority group, it can then make those people move away. So then the proportion of minorities will increase, and then more people will get kind of will be triggered to move out and so on. And in the end, you will get go to complete segregation, and you will have you will have white flight. When the proportion of minorities increase, majority individuals will choose to go elsewhere. And as I said, then David Card has provided data on this. That he says that we can see this white flight in data, that there is a tipping point. And this is from his paper, where we have on the horizontal axis, we have the percent of minority. I think this is data from Chicago, yes. So minorities, Hispanics or non-white in census tracts in 1970. And then he looks on the change in non-Hispanic white population in the following 10 years. And what he observes then is that in the neighborhood that has the lowest proportion of minority, between 0 and 5% on the horizontal axis, there we see that there the white population is increasing. But when it passes 5%, then you will have decreasing white population. So this then looks like white flight, so it's an argument then in favor of the Schelling model. So what has happened then in Sweden, if you look in the last 30 years, we have had a very rapid increase in the foreign-born population. And it also has been a change in the composition that we see here. The orange part of this graph are this is the non-European population. And so overall, we have the foreign-born population has increased, and an increasing proportion of the foreign-born population is a non-European. And if you see the non-European as a minority group, then this certainly would be a case where you should expect that there might be this trigger effect, that the tipping point has been passed, so we get increasing segregation. And when we go to the data, we can see that this is the case. So here we have then data on neighborhoods, the share of non-European migrants in a neighborhood on the horizontal axis, and then we see then population growth in different decades, in different time periods, and we see that in the growth, and there is the growth of the European-born population, kind of the white population, and we see that the higher the migrant share, then the faster is the decline in the white population. So this then looks like white flight. But then you can check them with a measure that urban researchers use for measuring segregation. And the most kind of the standard measure for this is the similarity index, which measures then how many of the minority group that would have to move in order to have an equal representation of migrants in all areas. And we see here that there is an increase in the 90s, but since then it has first been stable, and then the similarity index has been declining. So really, this is, yes, this looks like white flight, but in fact we don't see any increase in the amount of sorting in the urban areas. So this is kind of a bit strange, maybe. But if you look then on this, I'm not going to the details here, but this is then presented in the paper. In fact, if you do a simulation, if you take an urban city and with the neighborhoods that have different proportions of minorities, and then you increase the minority population, but you assume that you kind of impose that population increase across neighborhoods must be in such a way that the dissimilarity index is the same. Then what you get here is down here on the yellow bottom right corner, that you see here that here we have then the theoretically some simulated growth of the white population relative to neighborhood population in year 0. So then we see that in the neighborhoods with the smallest proportion of minorities, then there will be an increase in the white population, and in the other ones there will be a decrease in the white population. So this is, in fact, if you have constant segregation, then and what we have assumed here, that it's only the minority population that has grown. That in order to keep this sorting constant, most of them must go to the most minority dense neighborhoods. So this is so then the type of data that David Card present here cannot really be taken as evidence of a shelling type of process. And we have this shelling interpretation has been done also in Swedish data by researchers in Växjö, where they say that the Swedes, the white in Sweden, they can stand like 5% of non-whites, but after that they start to go away. But we argue that this is kind of really a misinterpretation of the data. So we do not see a shelling effect. We have expanding non-European population, but we see no increase in the segregation index, the similarity index, and instead, this evidence that looks like white flight could be seen as an almost mechanical effect in an equilibrium situation, to some extent, that there is something that keeps this sorting constant over time, but then there is some other factor working here that keeps the system in some kind of equilibrium. And this, some additional data on this can be seen in a paper where we compare segregation patterns in 4 and later 5 different European countries, where we looked then on the patterns of over and underrepresentations of non-European migrants across different neighborhoods. And we see in the top row here, we see that this is then quite small neighborhoods, 200 nearest persons. But we see that the different curves is showing that this pattern of under and overrepresentation in these 4 different countries. And we see that essentially they are the same. In Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, although we have quite different proportions of migrants and so on, it's kind of a very similar pattern. And then in the last panel with the red line, we have added Norwegian data. Also, we find the same there. So this almost kind of law-like. That is, these countries are to some extent different, but not very different. But we have very similar patterns. So again, you assume that there is some kind of equilibrating mechanism. So then, the next part of the paper that I wrote with Bill then looks at this and what we could consider as a possible factor here is that neighborhood reputation and stigmatization plays a role. That the Schelling model looks only on ethnic preferences. It has no concern for income, and then there are no house prices and so on. But if you add those factors, they might help to explain this. So what we find then in Swedish data is that there is a strong tendency for low-income individuals to be sorted into neighborhoods with high migrant density. And this is true then of irrespective if you are a migrant yourself or your Swedish background, it's low-income people that go into neighborhoods with the highest migrant density. And then there are some data here on how we have done this research. So we look at migrant density as in small neighborhoods, proportion of migrants among the 200 nearest neighbors, and we analyze different groups. We look at individual disposable income, and we measure it by percentiles, and then we divide the population into 10% bins based on the migrant density in the neighborhood. And then we look at what will the mean percentile disposable income look at when you vary across in neighborhoods with different migrant density. And the pattern that you get is this. So to the left we see the sorting of foreign-borns. In the middle we have sorting of Swedish-born with non-Swedish background, and on the right panel we see Swedish-born with Swedish background. And we do this in dense settlements on the one hand in non-metropolitan areas, but also then in metropolitan areas. And what we see here is that there is a very clear income gradient across neighborhoods with different migrant densities. And in fact this gradient is almost weaker for natives than it is for those with a migrant background. So there seems to be some factor here that kind of sorts individuals based on income into high migrant density and low migrant density neighborhoods. And in fact this relationship is stable over time. This graph here shows the entire population then in 1990 and 2012, and we see that the general pattern is the same, but the round circles, they show the situation in 1990, and the crosses show the situation in 2012, and we can see here, and this also gives a so we can see here that the 99th percentile in 2012, they have about close to 70% migrant share. But the corresponding figure in 1990 was a little bit over 50%. And so what is happening here is that we get more and more neighborhoods that have very high levels, high migrant densities. And but as I said, the relationship is almost constant. So what happens then in these neighborhoods with very high migrant shares is they have you get increasingly poor neighborhoods with low mean percentiles in disposable income. And this is income sorting. We have a clear pattern that low-income migrants are sorted into migrant-dense neighborhoods. This we can see in the. It's difficult. Yes, we have the foreign-born then in the top graph, and here we can see that for foreign-born, if we look, this is then these quantiles, demi-deciles they are called. So you can see here that this then is to the right end we have those that are in the poorest neighborhoods, and we see that then there is a very high representation of foreign-born with very low income. But if you look at neighborhoods that have lower migrant density, we see that they are kind of this is not the same type of sorting, and we see that also for Swedish-born that there is this sorting. So low-income Swedish-born are strongly overrepresented in migrant-dense neighborhoods. So what then? How should this be explained? This pattern, and in the paper, in fact, what we present there is a story of ethnic preferences, but in fact. Although we didn't stress it that much, and if the reviewer had been a bit more critical, they could say, "But how could this be ethnic preference? Because since it's affecting all groups." So instead, it's easier to link this to kind of territorial stigmatization or a negative neighborhood reputation. And this has, if you go to the kind of qualitative literature on segregation, this is a strong theme there where you can see that migrant-dense neighborhoods, or in the US, black neighborhoods are kind of portrayed as very bad places, and then they have a very low status. So it's and of course this can have, then that is one way to interpret this data, is that if you go to foreign-born, one way to interpret this is that foreign-born that get a higher income, they want to they go away from the most migrant-dense neighborhoods. They want to go into neighborhoods where there is lower migrant density. And in fact, almost one interpretation here could be that if you look at Swedish-born, that this is maybe even more important for those that are foreign-born. If you are Swedish-born and if you are white, then the stigma of living in this might be less than it is for a foreign-born person, and one who's kind of is a visible minority. And we also propose a model for this. If individuals prefer neighborhoods with a positive reputation, then housing costs in migrant dense area must be higher, because otherwise you wouldn't have a kind of equilibrium. Then you would have a demand. Most people would go to other areas. So that you can have, if you are do the kind of neoclassical model, you should expect kind of housing costs to increase in areas with low migrant density, and decrease in areas with high migrant density. And that this one then, so if you have a low income, then this is called concave preferences, that if you're gonna low income people, for them they will have to kind of it will hurt them more in terms of consumption to go into a good neighborhood with high housing costs. So they will kind of choose to tend to be in bad reputation neighborhoods. So that works quite well. But the thing is that why would migrant density lead to stigma? That is kind of what would be our explanation for this. And I think that then, so my current view is then that perhaps we should go back to what we talked about the kind of experience of the city. That it could be that kind of symbolic representation plays an important role here. It is the case that many migrants have low income. And if you look at non-European migrants, they often constitute a visible minority. They look different. So what you get then in in migrant dense neighborhoods, it becomes visible that there are many migrants here, and that this kind of becomes connected to people having low income. So it leads to a cognitive association between visible minority density and low income or low status, and that this kind of this cognitive association that triggers this process that then of course can become self-reinforcing when income sorting gets started. So then this leads to an interpretation of the Swedish case. We have had this increase in the foreign-born population with an increasing proportion of migrants from non-European countries. The dissimilarity index is constant, but if we look at what happens on the neighborhood level, when you have a constant sorting, but you increase the number of migrants, what you get then is that as we saw, that in the proportion of migrants in the most migrant-dense neighborhood will increase over time. So we see here, as we also looked at before, that in 1990, if you go to the 99th percentile in terms of migrant density, this is now non-European migrants. There were 20% non-European migrants, but if you go in 2017, there is 52% of non-European migrants in those neighborhoods. So what you observe here, so this, you could also kind of criticize this dissimilarity index, because it's the idea of the dissimilarity is that it should take away the group effect, or the size of the minority group. But if you instead look at kind of more in other circles, when you look at variation, you use the standard deviation to measure how variation in neighborhood composition, and we look at that simple measure. Then we see this kind of what you can call then a stronger segregation in that respect. And what this is, then we have increased variation in minority shares across neighborhoods, and this increased variability then would lead to stronger income sorting. So we have also then looked on income sorting across Swedish neighborhood types, across Swedish neighborhoods between 1990 and 2015. So what we have looked here we have taken data for the entire period. We have measured the share of different income decile among the nearest 1,600 neighbors across Sweden. And then we have done a cluster analysis, and then you get we took out 12 different cluster types. And then we show them here in terms of what does the income distribution look like. So here we have the richest, on the top row we have the richest neighborhoods, where we have 37% of people are in the highest decile. And on the other end we have those with very high proportions of poor people. So in this poor 4 cluster, there is 46% of the 1,600 nearest neighbors are in the lowest income decile, and then we have mixed neighborhoods. So this is kind of the different type of neighborhoods. So then we look at change over time, and then we can see that there is some increase then in the number of people that live in the richest neighborhoods. It goes up from 1.1% to 2.7%. There is a decline. We can see that in these mixed categories in the middle here, they declined from 35% to 23%. So the kind of middle was weakened. And then we instead look at the clusters with the poorest neighborhood types. They goes from 2.1% of the population to 9.6% of the population. So in fact we have this quite strong income polarization among the neighborhoods. That, as I see it, can be explained by this type of mechanism. So what has happened then in Sweden in this period is that we have had an emergence of neighborhoods with concentrated poverty, and which that we know from the American literature, the US literature, that concentrated poverty is really what, if you consider kind of what is the effect of segregation, is that one thing you can see that if your neighborhood with concentrated poverty, those neighborhoods tend to have problems that are not so nice, and especially in terms of crime, but also in other factors. That was the kind of aggregate evidence, but we also have looked at micro evidence. This is then also Bill Clark in this paper, and also Eva Andersson. So we have been 3 authors, where we looked at on a specific court, a court born in 1986. And we looked at where they lived at age 15, and then we went, that was in 2001, and then we went 15 years further to 2016 at age 30. And to see kind of where on this spectrum of poverty do these individuals live. And the neighborhood measure was the proportion of population at risk of poverty. That is the European measure of relative poverty, less than 60% of median disposable income. And again, we use neighborhood percentiles to represent them. So this is then, if you look then, this is by geographical background in 2001 at age 15. And then we see then that if you look at the gray staplar columns, we show that there is a very strong overrepresentations of migrant with non-European background in the poorest neighborhoods. You have it here, so these are the poverty percentiles, so we see that there is very strong overrepresentation there. Then we go to 2016, and then it looks very much better, I would say. There is still some overrepresentation of non-European migrants in the. These are when the same individuals are at age 30 in the most poor neighborhoods, but there has been very much a kind of reversal to the mean. So this is kind of good news. That is, I think, seldom reported in the press, that there is often this story that we have neighborhoods where people kind of are stuck in place, but this is really not the case. And you can also see that the similarity index declines then from 37 to 90. So there is really kind of a strong integration story here, which then is good. And this is also then true of if you look specifically on the non-European not with non-European background. So we have a total of 8,293 non-European background migrants in our sample. A large proportion of the 43% of them lived in the 10% poorest neighborhoods. 1,200 of them, 1,272, were still in this 10% poorest in 2016. These are the ones that you could say kind of stuck in place. They grew up in a poor neighborhood and they are still there. But in fact, then 2,303 individuals have moved out from this poorest category of the neighborhoods, and that's kind of 64% that move out. So it's that's kind of a good story. The not so good story, if you look at those that are still stay on in the poorest neighborhoods. Here we have some data on them in terms of background factors and also later factors. And so the ones that are coded 1-1, they were in a poor area in 2001, and they're still in a poor area in 2016. So first we can look at school grades. We see that they have much poorer school grades than the other groups. They have their length of education is much smaller. Much larger proportion have children already at age 25. Highest income is not too bad. You see the proportion of social allowance when they were 15 years of age was very high for this group. They were also to a large extent living with single mothers. They have a very low share of employed parents. Family disposable income was low, and parents with tertiary education. So we see that this is the ones that stay put in the poorest areas is really kind of an exposed group. And of course this is then, but this, as I said, this is micro evidence for what I already have shown, that there are these two stories here. So on the one hand, great, Sweden is an open society, the society of opportunity, people can move out, they grow up in these poor neighborhoods, and then they move out. On the other hand, there is also this kind of persistent poverty, and that's, of course, sometimes it's difficult to have, but you really need to have. And sometimes migrants are discussed in terms of kind of averages, that on average migrants have kind of poor opportunities in Sweden and so. But I think that it could be really that what we should be looking on with respect to migrants is higher rates of variation. That there are some, so that in the Swedish background population kind of are close to the average, but in the migrant population you both see kind of quite good outcomes, but also people that have very bad outcomes. So it's there is high, and there is also data. If you look at school results, you see the same, that it's really these differences, large variation. So okay, but I'm getting to the end of my presentation. So what we. But there is some more coming. Yes, sorry, I forgot those 10 maps that I'm going to show you. So we are going to look at consequences then finally. And what the outcome variable that I will look on here is crime pattern. Because in the project that I'm currently working on here at the Institute for Future Studies, it's a project that is directed interested in crime patterns. So I've chosen an illustration from that part. And the theory here is that, as I said, in the US, concentrated poverty has been pointed out as a strong determinant of neighborhood crime levels, especially violent crime. And so if you just take that evidence from the US and say, what show it to a researcher who has nothing from Sweden, say, this has happened in Sweden, what do you think about the crime rates, the local violent crime rates? You should really expect that there should be an increase. This is this increase in violent crime, which is not in yellow, as our colleagues in criminology often point out, but of course now it's shooting that is the most visible form of violent crime, and there we have seen this. So so one thing is that it's how it should be. If you get this type of segregation development in segregation, and especially with this high concentration of poverty, this is what we should see. But we can look then on, does it fit with the Swedish case? That's where I'm going. But first, then I will show this. This is then a report that has been published now at my home department, and it's a part of the project that Gustav mentioned here, where we have kind of classified residential location in Sweden based on socioeconomic indicators, the local level of employment, if the people are employed, if they have tertiary education, if they have high income, to the extent they are poor, if they have social assistance, if they are the proportion of EU migrants and non-EU migrants. And we look at population composition at different scale levels. So we look both on the kind of what is looked in the closest neighborhood, but also kind of somewhat farther away. And then based on this, we have also done a cluster analysis, and that is really to generate. We want to see then to what extent part of the project is then to see kind of can you see a correspondence between this local social demographic composition and attitudes and so on. But it also then to make clusters is also a good way that to illustrate this spatial variation in population composition. So what I will show here then are a number of maps. So in the diagrams to the right, you can see these different indicators. So on the top it's employment and tertiary education, and the next one is high income and poverty, and then it's social assistance and EU migrants, and then it's non-EU. And what we have here on the horizontal axis, that is the kind of scale level. So it's to the left we have in the closest neighborhoods, and to the right we have kind of larger neighborhoods. And so here we find then to the right, this is the first is the urban elite clusters, which we see they have very high rates of employment and tertiary education. They have a large proportion of high income people, very low levels of poverty, very low levels of social assistance, and relatively few migrants. Quite a lot of EU migrants, in fact, but not that many non-EU migrants. And then we see the maps. And everyone who knows Sweden is not so surprised. So we can see that we see the affluent neighborhoods in the Stockholm area to the northeast. Rich people like to be close to the sea, at least in Sweden. And we have the same pattern in Gothenburg, that they are along the coast and in the Malmö area and so on. So this is the urban elite areas. It's easy to see. Then we have the urban academic, and they also have high levels of tertiary education, but as you can see that in terms of income, the proportion with high income is much smaller. There are kind of intermediate levels of poverty and some social assistance, but not that many EU migrants, somewhat more non-EU migrants. So this, and we see that this is kind of the typical Södermalm area, the hipster areas then. But you also find them then in the university cities around Sweden. Then we have the urban diverse, and here we see that the poverty levels are very high. Social assistance is relatively high, and there are high proportions both of EU migrants and of non-EU migrants. Tertiary education is in fact on kind of intermediate level. It's not really on the bottom. And of course here we see the neighborhood locations of them. Also we know them quite well from these are the migrant dense areas. Then we have also the urban homogeneous areas. And here you can see that these are really in the contrast then. If you look at the number of EU migrants, there are some EU migrants there, but very, very few non-EU migrants. And we see them, and they have not that high education, so they are the education level compared to the elite areas is declining. Income is quite high, poverty is high, and we find them then is kind of outer periphery of the metropolitan areas. This is the category that we didn't really expect to find. This is rural town diverse. And here we can see then you have these scale effects. If you look at social assistance, which is for you who are in the room here, or maybe you see it here, you see that at the small scale there are very high levels of social assistance and also of poverty. But when you expand the neighborhood, these levels go down. So these are, and we find them then across Sweden. In small settlements, we expect that they are in areas with there are also in the small cities there are kind of rental dwellings that were built in the 60s and 70s and maybe not are that popular anymore, but then they have been empty. So many see that there are large proportions of especially non-EU migrants coming here, and our idea about this is that it reflects then the allocation of mainly of refugees in the 2000s to these smaller areas. And we see here also what is a characteristic of them. If you look at tertiary education, they are really at a low level of tertiary education. Much lower than if you look at the metropolitan diverse district. And these are then the rural town adjacent, which then surrounds it. So here you have the different pattern, and that here you have kind of low social assistance and low number of migrants in the close area, but when you go into the dense settlement, then there are more migrants there. And we also have rural working class areas. And here you can see that these are then the traditional industrial areas in Sweden, and we see that one factor here is that they have really high level of EU migrants. So our idea is that to some extent this reflects kind of the migration that was in earlier in Sweden, which very much meant to these industrial areas. And then we have the white areas with very low levels of migrants, but they are not that rich. If you look at employment, could be quite low, and so on. So then tertiary education is low. But these are the white areas of Sweden. And then we also find the rural border areas. But this is kind of statistical artifact. People that work in Norway, in Denmark, or Finland, they don't register any income in Sweden, so therefore they turn out to be poor. So those are the areas. But so we have a really strong. Yes, that was Jutta. Yes, I forgot to mention that Jutta Cavalocci is the one who has made this. Work with this classification, but you saw that on the report. So segregation is not restricted to urban areas, and it occurs in different dimensions. So, but finally, then is this what is Matthias? What's his first name? Grell? Matthias? Mannegerell and Amir has published this paper on shootings and the overlap with the open drug markets. This is shooting on between 2011 and 2017, and then Henrik here has overlaid the Utah clusters, the ones that I showed you, with these shootings. And here you have the green ones are then these urban diverse areas, and we see, of course, that this is where you get the shooting. So it's and there are some other places, but many of it, in fact, if you look closely on this, can be found along the subway system. So we have this pattern of this type of violence and being very concentrated in these areas with concentrated poverty. So that was what I had to say today. Where is that?
Thank you very much. So then we are turning into the question period of this seminar. The first half hour is going to be filmed. For you who are here in the audience here, you can just put up your hand if you want to ask a question. And for you online, just write it in the chat. And as we are a mixed researcher, please write your discipline too. So we like to mix questions from different disciplines. We also allow for follow-up questions, and you can just write follow-up to the person who asked the question. So with that, let me actually start very quickly with one question. The only thing I didn't understand in this, a lot of interesting stuff in it. I understand why a Schelling model with ethnic preferences or racial preference couldn't explain anything of this. But why couldn't a Schelling model with some kind of income or class preference explain these patterns that you showed?
I mean, I would get the same if I had ranked them according to poverty. If that was the case, I'm not sure that you would get this result that over time that you would get an increase in. Then you would have this that could happen any time. Then you would, in any society, if people were good at kind of observing income levels and reacting on that, then you would then this ethnic you would see the same pattern then very clearly also in societies with low level that have no visible minorities. So if you can show that's the case,
I asked you, you're the expert. Have you looked into that? Whether that would be
so what you see here that this has happened then in Sweden in a period. If you 1990, Sweden had the level of number of visible minorities in Sweden at that time was very low.
But also sometimes we have had an increased income gap and increased inequality. So, and also maybe, I'm just speaking, but there are also some more connections of a kind of a welfare state where the services have turned out to be worse, like schooling and other things. So I'm just speculating, but it seems to be a competing explanation, at least that needs to be ruled out with some facts.
So this is kind of a hypothesis, but what I do think, if you kind of consider this stigmatization literature, where it's also very easy to see that you don't have to speculate, and that there is this kind of idea of certain type of neighborhood being very poor and being low status, and that they are connected then to and they are called kind of segregated neighborhoods, and that's because what people point out is that the kind of the ethnic mixing of them. So I think that in my view, I think this process to get going needs some kind of energy that goes from this kind of. That's why I think about this symbolic representation. And in fact, another example of this would be that when we go back to the 1970s, when kind of segregation started to be an issue in Sweden, then it wasn't the color of the people that were kind of used as a signal for poor neighborhoods, but it was the height of the buildings. So it was called höghus, high-rise buildings. So it's well, I shouldn't go too far into this, but it's but I think in this I think that my argument is that you should kind of consider that these kind of representations that we have, they play an important role. And one inspiration for this is we had a discussion on lunch here on philosophers, and one that I have read recently that has to some extent inspired me is then Cassirer, who has this philosophy of symbolic forms, which says that really that when we understand the world, we understand it in terms of symbols, kind of material representations of the world that we use. We sit around and we play with these things, that they can be numbers or letters and so on, and these are kind of really kind of symbolic representations of the world, but in fact our understanding of the world is based on these visible symbols that are almost material. So then that would then explain why because once it's strange that color of the skin should be a factor here. People should be rational and they should look in how much they are earning. But in fact, I do think that we have this very strong association in the U.S. and in Sweden and other countries where you have this accumulation of people with a different color that they become a representation of poverty, and then so that can fuel the process. So I think that's. You can fool me, but but this is a seminar, so now I go there. And I think it could be the same with sex. That we have these kind of differences between men and women, and when we think in terms of sex, it's because but then it's kind of symbolic representations that we kind of try to sort things based on these sex differences. So it's not a quantitative answer to your question. If it's, I think I got that from the reviewers, but it is.
It's an interesting. So then we have Moa.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this very interesting presentation. So I have a question about because I think one thing that is specific to Sweden is our rental housing system, and I was just wondering how. Because you mentioned early in the presentation when you introduced the Schelling model that we are not channeling people based on ethnicity to different locations. But I do think that we are channeling newcomers into specific segments of the housing market to the unpopular places. If you have a long line, if you have a good position in the queue, you can choose where to live. If you don't have a long time in the queue, then you have to go to specific places, and that correlates with ethnicity. So it's not, we're not channeling people based on ethnicity by intent, but in effect, this is what is happening, right? And I was thinking about that also when you mentioned the interesting 1986 corporate study, where people sort of move upwards in the housing hierarchy as time passes, and that maybe this phenomena is fairly specific to Sweden. I mean, in the US you don't have this same kind of phenomena, but sort of long lines in rental housing queues and all that. How do you have how I'm sure you've thought about this. How have you thought about this in terms of your explanation?
I mentioned the kind of model that I've been kind of thinking about, which then works easier if you have kind of market. If you had kind of market rents all over, then this would be, if there is this would be reflected in rent level or housing, how the cost of housing, housing prices and so on. But it will, in the Stockholm context, there is if you can pay, you can go out from. You don't have to live in areas where it's easy to get rental housing. So there is this kind of gradient in this respect in the Stockholm area and many others, and also there is of course the queue is, economists would say that the length of the queue is also kind of an economic it's kind of sorting mechanism. So that certainly sorts people that have arrived recently in Sweden into these neighborhoods. But to compare it to the US, But also you also have the role of vacancies then in rental housing. That if you have areas that are if you have an area that has I forgot the name here, bad reputation, that people will if when they get an opportunity or the means to do it, they move out there, and that will also create then vacancies in that, so that will open up for newly arrived migrants. And so that you see also in the US that the migrants in many cases they start out in quite poor areas, and there they think that in many cases then when they get more settled they can move out of these areas, but we don't see that much in if you look at the kind of adult migrants. Our assumption was that we should see this out migration when people become better established, but we don't see that much. So it seems that this kind of this youth mobility is much more important. This is the phase in the life where you are very mobile. So that part is important for this income sorting. And that I think you would have the same. But this is a bit sensitive in the US. It's a bit sensitive. I think I can say that in the US, one explanation for segregation there is that it's part of discrimination. And my reading of the reports from the US is that they haven't been looking that much into this income sorting. If you look at the black populations, but in fact I think there is quite extensive out migration of better off blacks from the poorest neighborhoods, and of course then that could be a factor then in the US also. So I don't know.
Satisfied? Happy with that? Okay, then Joseph.
Yeah, thank you so much. One question is, does one see that much concentrated poverty in other places in Europe as well, or is it lower in, for example, France or parts of Germany? This is the first one. The second one is who moves into these areas once that make it out? I mean, who replaces the little bit better educated and well off? And do I read it right that something like a white trash phenomena, like in the US, does not exist in Sweden? That it's completely confined to migrants?
Can you repeat the question? The first one was on
if they're in other European countries, you see a similar phenomenon where you get so high levels of concentrated poverty.
I haven't looked at the French data because we haven't. They have slightly worse data there. I think it's improving in France to have this kind of low-level data. And in France, they have been historically. They almost they are the other way around. They don't recognize that there are non-French people. Everyone, if you're a citizen, you're a citizen. So then they are sometimes reluctant to publish small-scale data on ethnic composition.
You're not allowed to register it. You're not allowed to register that kind of data.
But they could have you could country of birth. They don't have that. But in Belgium you have it. In Belgium you have one pattern we saw that is that they also have the quite high levels of concentration of poverty, especially in central Brussels. In Sweden we have this that they are in the suburbs, but in Brussels you find them in the center of the city, in parts of the center of the city. When we had a paper on this looking on comparing these cities, and then Karan is here, so maybe she could answer. I think that we didn't have this. We didn't do this exactly the same way. But as in the Netherlands, they seem what that data suggested was that they were more kind of successful in avoiding having concentrated poverty. And we are not quite sure what the reason for this is, but it could be that the public housing in the Netherlands, as I understand it, I'm a bit, I hope there is someone there who can correct me, that there they try to avoid this kind of symbolic representation. They tend, as I understand it, that they if you go down a street, the houses look the same. Some of these are public housing and some of them are private housing, but you cannot really tell from the outside which is what. And so that would be then, according, if this symbolic representation idea is correct, then you shouldn't kind of differentiate what the buildings look like, and also then don't have large scale. Of course, that is a factor also, that you have kind of these large scale processes, which they seem to be avoiding in the Netherlands. White trash is a word that there is no white trash in Sweden, kind of in terms of, it's not a category that is used, and I have kind of problems with it also in the US context. It's really, I don't think that you should use it. But you mean kind of low income people with social problems that are white? Yes. If you look at the national data, we haven't been. We're not finished in this project. We also look at kind of now we are doing, instead of having kind of this cross-sectional data, we are looking now on the trajectories that people follow over time, because that is more if you want to see this someone who is permanently in low income and so on. And so and our results so far are ready for the 65 plus group, and in that there you can find what we found is something what a bit strange is that we found people with low income living in single family dwellings, and that there is one type of housing where you could expect low income. And in fact we had that in this if you look at the rule of homogeneous. You see that in terms of social assistance, those are here poverty level here, so it's quite high in these areas, and this is then if you, and of course this is, it could also be that people that have health problems and so on, that they, instead of being in the city, if they cannot work, they move in, they can find cheap housing in the countryside, and so if you are looking for this kind of this poor white, I think that would be one place to look for them. You also find, at least historically, find single males living in central city, but they might no longer be around. But if you look at these old cores, you find, in fact, you found them some poor singles living in central cities also.
Happy with that? Or?
Yes. The last question was who replaces.
I haven't looked into this, but one group that is moving into this area. If you want to move away from home in Stockholm, one possibility, if you have a few years of being in the housing queue, then there are you can get apartments in these areas. So those would be one. And then you have also then migrants going as we saw that in this, if you go to the urban diverse category, we see that there are the level of education is quite high. So and many of the, as I understand, one important motive for people coming from outside of Europe or going to Sweden, to kind of migrate to Sweden, is that and if you interview them, they have very high aspirations for their children. So one interpretation of this migration is that no, they are not going to Sweden because they want to make a big career here and earn a lot of money. But they do think that going here and where there is this kind of public school system and so on, and pushing their children, they will be able then to get a good education. So that there is a kind of strong push for many migrants that are looking to come to these areas. So as long as there is high migration, I don't think there will be problems of renting out these apartments.
Fine. Then next is Joe. You need a microphone. Or you can use my microphone.
Thanks. So I want to ask you a bit more about the beginning part, the Schelling model bit.
Yes.
And it's kind of a question about the methodology, I guess. The explanatory hypotheses are all about ethnicity, ethnic preferences, visible minorities, and so on. But the data you're using has to do with immigration, foreign-born, non-EU migrants, and so on. But I suppose just thinking about this versus the US, like there are going to be some not quite perfect mappings between being a Swedish-born and being white. Now, is this, I guess, part of the reason for using this proxy is this is the data that's available, maybe? But do you know, I don't know enough about migration patterns in Sweden, so like how many second-generation Swedes will show up as Swedish-born but will be visible minorities, and are they going to make any problem for your model, or do you think the numbers are not going to matter?
If you look at this 1986 cohort here, so then there are about in Sweden. Sweden is easy. There is about in almost every year there is the cohort size in Sweden around 100,000, and this is true also here. And these are non-European background individuals. So they might have parents that are might have been born outside of Europe, or they have parents that are born outside of Europe. So, but you see that there is it's not a and they were here, but they were here then in 2001. So that was the criteria. They are born in. They don't have to be born in Sweden, but they were here in 2001. But then, so you were talking about this. Having this as the white category, Swedish born with non-Swedish background. No, Swedish born with Swedish background. So there we will start having, I think this would be then, if you have kind of grandchildren of non-European migrants, will end up in these categories. And of course we will be able to have them, since we had really the first non-European migrants that came to Sweden, as I remember, is in the early 70s with the Chileans, Latin Americans. So they will have some people then. So that will the fit then will kind of being a visible minority will not be. But if you want to get it, you still we have this multi-generation, so you can find out the grandparents also if you have this drop of blood theory of being a non-European. So it's possible, but it's so but to some extent I like this. These are kind of correlated with the appearance, but they are in fact these are kind of geographical factors. So it's so that's.
Okay. Yeah. I think I didn't understand. So background means this something kind of technical. It has to do with like the category that you would put the person's parents into in terms of their place of birth.
The background here is then the country of birth of parents.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you can have one drop theory, two drop. If there is one per peer.
But the data you work with is enough with one parent that are born outside
I
Sweden.
think this is yes. I have to go to see if it's one parent or two parent that are non-Swedish. I'm not quite sure in this case where if you have one parent or two parents. But background is parent.
Good. So then next is Karim.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. So I have two questions. One is, and this is just maybe I misunderstood the model or the explanation, but it seemed to me that you suggested that this was a self-reinforcing process. But you also said that these trends have seemed to be tapering off, or in some cases reversing, at least with regards to the concentration of low-income foreign-born people in these, or the overrepresentation of foreign-born in the lowest income areas. So I was
you mean the court study?
Yeah.
So there were two studies
Ah,
here.
that was not.
This is the court study.
Ah, okay.
So there you have for the individuals. Then you have this that they are moving out.
Right.
But then these are the ones born in 1986 so it still could be the case that if you look at people that have arrived recently, that if you look at people born in that are 15 years of age now, that born in 2005, that you would still find a pattern like this, possibly. We haven't looked at that.
Okay.
But
okay.
But the evidence that we have there is this here. So this. I don't see it. This goes at least until 2017, and here we see that the concentration of non-European migrants in the most migrant-dense neighborhoods is continued to increasing here.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. And I don't know. So this is kind of I've been working on these fibers that you have. This is what people in the press would say. Look here, we have increasing segregation. But then the researchers are quite stubborn, and they use instead this to measure segregation. So you can see that there are kind of and many you can. I was interviewed by the economists that say, not on this study, but that we have this. So you can say, oh, segregation is declining. And what is happening here, well, I don't have to go into time here. One reason why this is declining is that we have had totally white areas, 0% areas with 0% on the European migrants, but where that's increasing, and that is kind of captured by this dissimilarity index. The sorting process, which I kind of, if you say that the sorting process is that person comes, and then you throw a dice and then you send them to some place. That's the sorting. But when there are more people coming from a specific group, although the underlying sorting process is the same, it will result in high concentration as long as that. So that's it. But it's again, this is kind of that you need to have kind of slightly more advanced model in your head than that people in the press and we as researchers also. There is problematic to deal with these issues sometimes.
Okay, I see. So I had another question, and that's how does gentrification fit into this model? And could gentrification be a way to prevent or to combat or to reverse segregation?
That's an interesting point. If you're in the kind of segregation camp, and I also been then in this kind of neighborhood effects, where you really the problem with segregation is if there is an effect of your local conditions on your possibilities in life, then if some people live in areas with high rates of poverty, that will have affect their possibility of outcome, and then kind of high rates of poverty is bad. So then, also I wasn't even in this area. But then then you start reading this gentrification literature. As a segregation researcher, I think mixing is good. But if you're a gentrification researcher, mixing is bad. That is the bad thing, the worst thing that can happen, that the rich people move into poor areas. I thought there was this, someone has put on Facebook that I'm really doing my, what I expect to do. I'm staying here in my white neighborhood and not going into those poor black neighborhoods. I'm really I'm the hero of anti-gentrification movement. So segregation. So that's. But then the question was, could gentrification? I think I'm in. I think has a potential, yes, for and the important and also, but then of course it has to be within the context. Then you must and really the issue with gentrification, if someone is kind of, if there is a rent, if there is kind of increased demand for in a certain area by kind of higher income people, that will of course then make it more difficult to poor people maybe to get in housing there. So the question is where will they go? So my idea is that you cannot have that as the only solution to get more mixing, but you also have to provide opportunities for low income people in other type of neighborhoods. And that I think, but that's it's but maybe I don't know. I have to listen to political parties. The Social Democrats, they are against segregation, but I really the right-wing people, they are against utsatta områden and crime. But are they really prepared to do something against segregation? What you should do then is that they should provide, as they maybe are doing in the Netherlands, opportunities for low-income housing in high-income areas. That will generate mixing, and it will also then. And then someone told me that in Singapore, in relation to this symbolic representation, someone told me that in Singapore they are really enforcing really strict ethnic integration. They have on the kind of property level. Have you heard about it? Is it true? Is it true?
Yeah.
So there should be there are quotas for different ethnicities. And of course that is good because then you can break this connection between. So it's possible to do things against segregation, but it's and of course it's easy then you want to say that segregation is about them in these neighborhoods, but it's not really, as I said, that we're in one city, so we are kind of all part of this process of with dealing with this neighborhood reputation and adjusting our behavior to that one. So and I think that to realize this, that this is a process that we are kind of all engaged are involved in is important if you want to kind of find to kind of be clear on that and to see that has to be, if we want to address segregation, those are things that they need to be dealt with.
Very good, but then if there's no more questions on that note, join me in thanks for this very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you for good questions.
And I should mention that the next talk coming up, which is the last for this term, is Daniel Hausman, Allocating Healthcare Fairly. Start at 1500 since he is on the east coast of the United States, so he will be online. Very welcome to that. Thank you.